On Thursday, South Korea announced it would terminate its military intel sharing pact with Japan called GSOMIA, which was signed in 2016. The main reason for the big decision that caught many in Korea and overseas off guard was that the pact no longer serves Korea's national interest, as Japan has caused a change in the bilateral security cooperation environment by imposing economic restrictions against South Korea. Japan was quick to react, expressing regret and summoning the Korean ambassador to file a complaint. And the U.S. has also strongly voiced concerns and disappointment over Seoul's decision. Today, we go in depth on the aftermath of the GSOMIA termination and the future of security affairs in Northeast Asia. For that, we're joined by Dr. Myong-hyun, a research fellow at the Asan Institute for Policy Studies. Welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
So Seoul had until this Saturday to decide whether to extend the GSOMIA for another year or not, but 2 days ahead of its deadline, it announced its termination. Now, many were expecting a conditional extension of the pact, but the Seoul government just went ahead and scrapped the deal altogether. What do you think is the main reason?
Well, clear. I mean, the general perception is that cancellation of the GSOMIA agreement is directed at Japan. So this is actually an extension of the ongoing spat between the two countries, starting with the historical issues and the judgment over the forced labor, which actually resulted in the Japanese response of imposing export control against South Korea. And one might think that this is a way for South Korea to pressure Japan to revert its previous actions against South Korea. But I think it goes beyond that. I think we have to look into the fact that President Moon has been looking into somehow establishing some sort of a dialogue with Japan to resolve all these thorny issues over historical sentiments and judgment against Japanese interests in South Korea. But I think President Moon has essentially given up on that. I think he's declaring with this measure that he's no longer going to talk to Japan and reason with Japan to sort of come up with a reasonable outcome to this. I think he's going beyond this and directing the angle of his a strategy on Washington. I think we tend to think of GSOMIA as a bilateral agreement between Japan and South Korea, but the United States is a major stakeholder in this agreement. And the reason is the United States wants to see trilateral security cooperation to be the backbone of the security architecture for the United States in this region. And South Korea, by going after GSOMIA, is essentially telling Washington to be a lot more active and also apply pressure on Japan to come up with a very creative solution to resolve this ongoing tension between the two countries, because we know that the United States, it looked like it was sitting on the sidelines when the spat was going on. And I think South Korea is putting a lot of, it's gambling a lot right now. And then at the same time, it's using that as a leverage to pressure not just Japan, but the United States.
So U.S. played an important role in facilitating the GSOMIA to begin with. Now, on a related note, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has said he was disappointed to hear the news, while the Pentagon has also voiced strong concerns over Seoul's decision. Foreign Minister Kang Kyung-hwa, though, has said that GSOMIA is an issue that is separate from South Korea-U.S. alliance. But is it really? How do you gauge the termination of GSOMIA, its impact on the South Korea-U.S. alliance?
Anyone who's aware and knowledgeable about the background of this agreement, the GSOMIA agreement, and the history behind it, won't be able to say what Minister Kang has just said, that this is about, it's nothing to do with the alliance. It has everything to do with the alliance. It's all about the alliance here in the Northeast Asia with the United States. And as I mentioned before, United States is a major stakeholder in this agreement. And then, for instance, United States, one of the United States' objective is to establish a missile defense system in this region. And what really underlies the missile defense system is GSOMIA, because GSOMIA allows a real-time intelligence sharing between Korea and Japan and the United States. So that's the reason why the United States has reacted in a very negative manner about this move by South Korea. It demonstrates that what Minister Kang said about the alliance is wrong. Clearly, it's true about the alliance. It's going to have a very strong, significant implication for the future of the alliance between South Korea and the United States, because I think the United States might redo its calculation about the future of the security cooperation between South Korea and Japan, and then might actually assign a lesser role for South Korea in this future of security architecture, and that's not going to serve South Korea's interest in the long run, and that's the biggest concern that we have right now about this.
Well, it sounds like South Korea and the U.S. both appear to be at an important crossroads in terms of future regional security strategy. Now, Seoul's defense ministry has said that GSOMIA will expire in November, but it will keep the trilateral information sharing arrangement, or TISA, that Seoul has with Tokyo and Washington. But do you think TISA would effectively replace GSOMIA?
So TISA came up because, 3 years ago, I believe, probably longer than that, because South Korea wasn't ready to sign GSOMIA. And the difference between TISA and GSOMIA is that GSOMIA allows the three countries to have real-time intelligence sharing, whereas TISA essentially is what's going to happen from now on, which is there will be no direct sharing of intelligence between Tokyo and Seoul. Instead, the United States is going to serve as a hub of intelligence sharing, meaning if there's something happens in the Korean Peninsula, then South Korea is going to send the intelligence, piece of intelligence to Washington, then Washington is going to share that with Tokyo. So there will no longer be a real-time intelligence sharing. And as I said before, intelligence sharing is a real-time intelligence sharing is going to be the key component in the establishment of a missile defense system, because we are talking about intercepting a ballistic missile in a matter of milliseconds now. So that's why it's a very pressing issue for the three countries to have a real-time intelligence sharing, and the South Korean termination of the GSOMIA totally undermines this idea.
South Korea's Deputy National Security Advisor Kim Hyun-jong today held a follow-up briefing where he said that South Korea no longer sees the necessity to keep GSOMIA, as Japan has rejected South Korea's numerous requests for dialogue on pending issues, including trade and the compensation of Japan's wartime forced labor. How do you see his remarks?
Well, this is actually taking a page from the Japanese playbook. When Japan instated export control on South Korea, what Japan did was to essentially break the firewall between economy and politics. Essentially, Japan politicized trade with South Korea, and for which Japan received a lot of criticism from the international community. And at the same time, that put South Korea, gave South Korea a moral upper hand. And so South Korea could lead the argument against Japan based on the free trade grounds. But now what South Korea did was to essentially break the firewall, actually get rid of the firewall between politics and security. There's this implicit understanding here that you have two parallel tracks when it comes to Korea-Japan relations, which is we don't mix politics and security. There might be a lot of confrontation when it comes to political issues, but when it comes to security, there will be a cooperation all the time. But then now South Korea has mixed the two. But then the problem for South Korea is that when Japan mixed politics and economy, Japan only has South Korea on the other side. So it was like a very much of a one-on-one kind of a conflict. Whereas now, it's not just Japan that South Korea is going after, it's also the United States. So for Japan, this is a much more convenient way of continuing this tension with South Korea, because South Korea has just broadened the front, and now the United States on the Japanese side. By necessity, and the United States might have to respond to this, which actually is going to favor Japan now.
Now, GSOMIA is known to have been signed between Seoul and Tokyo initially to better counter North Korean threats. And having said that, some are pointing out that the termination of GSOMIA would be music to the ears to the North Korean regime. How do you think North Korea is observing all this?
Well, it's for North Korean, this doesn't hurt their interest, clearly. But on the other hand, for North Koreans, their concern is it goes beyond the real-time intelligence sharing. Even TISA for North Korea is too much for them. So in that sense, for North Korea, the cancellation, the termination of GSOMIA doesn't represent a significant reduction in terms of deterrence posed against them by the allies here. but on the other hand, for China, this is like a manna from heaven. This is what the Chinese wanted all along, because that's the reason why the Chinese asked Moon administration to give them assurances about so-called three assurances that South Korea is not going to agree to additional deployment of a THAAD missile defense system, that South Korea is not to participate in the wider missile defense system scheme in Northeast Asia, and also South Korea will oppose creating a trilateral alliance between Japan, South Korea, and the United States. Now that the South Korea has terminated GSOMIA, has essentially confirmed to the Chinese that South Korea won't be part of the missile defense system, for sure. And so, I mean, so for the Chinese, I think that this is actually a major gift, an unexpected gift from South Korea, and they don't have to work for it either. So, so in that sense, you know, these are, international security is a zero-sum game. So what favors China is represents a detriment to South Korea.
Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe has said that South Korea is continuing with its actions that harm bilateral trust, and that Japan will continue to strengthen its ties with the U.S. for regional security. How do you forecast future Korea-Japan relations?
Well, it's going to be a cold peace going on between the two countries. I mean, we don't know what's going to happen, what will be the domestic repercussion of termination of GSOMIA here in South Korea. But so far, before the termination of GSOMIA, you know, I mean, standing up to Japan favored President Moon politically in many ways. We know that his approval rating went up. I mean, there's like a rally around the flag kind of effect going on. So his approval rating went up when he was, you know, standing up to Abe and all that. So Abe enjoyed a similar positive impact in his approval rating, and that led to the successful win in his upper house election in Japan months ago. So, I mean, there's no incentive, at least no domestic incentive on either side to stand down at the moment. So, but then the question is whether Japan might escalate this by imposing further measures against South Korea. And right now, I think Japan has just regained the so-called moral upper hand vis-a-vis South Korea, because GSOMIA has essentially undermined the alliance here in the Northeast Asia. So it will be excessive if Japan takes further retaliatory measure against South Korea. And also, as I mentioned before, it's actually the United States will have to mount response on South Korea's action this time. So, I mean, if Japan is reasonable enough, I think Japan is going to stay behind the scenes and let the United States pressure South Korea to reverse this measure.
But do you expect actual retaliatory measures from Japan soon?
I don't think so. Actually, I think what Japan has gained this time is quite intangible but very significant, meaning it has confirmed in the eyes of the United States that Japan could be a more reliable ally here in Northeast Asia, and also that Japan is a more constructive player, so to speak, for the United States, a long-term strategy in Asia-Pacific region. So that's, I mean, and then at the same time, cancellation of GSOMIA, although it undermines Japan's security situation, there's also a possibility that South Korea might have to reinstate the GSOMIA agreement if North Korea engages in very significant provocation down the road, maybe later this year. So in that sense, I think there's no reason for the Japanese to be in a hurry to come out with a retaliation against South Korea.
Now, South Korea and Japan had been sharing top secrets on North Korea through GSOMIA. And given that, as you've mentioned, that GSOMIA was facilitated by the U.S., do you think the termination would have some kind of an impact on future Pyongyang-Washington nuclear talks?
Again, Pyongyang has said in the last couple of months that they don't need South Korea to be an intermediary to facilitate dialogue between Washington and Pyongyang. So they already have a direct channel of communication with President Trump himself, through the letters, exchanges, and all that. So South Korea, according to North Korean own statements, South Korea has become a non-entity, a significant variable in the ongoing negotiations with the United States. So that's going to be the case from going forward. So I don't think it's going to affect the negotiation between Washington and Pyongyang, although it actually favors North Korea in a marginal way, because what's implicit in the ongoing negotiation is that if the negotiation breaks down, then we are going to go back to what we experienced back in 2017, which is the rise in the threat of a preemptive strike by the United States. If there's no GSOMIA, and then also there's a deterioration in the security cooperation between South Korea, Japan, and the United States, it'll be much more difficult for the United States to engage in a credible military action against North Korea. So in that sense, I think it gives more freedom, so to speak, or more space for North Korea to try to insisting much more favorable terms of negotiation on the United States. So this favors the North Koreans for sure, but then probably not to an extent that some people expect.
Well, what started off as a historical issue expanded to an economic issue, and now we also have to have security concerns. Let's keep close tabs on how things unfold from this point. Thank you so much, Dr. Go, as always, for your insights.
My pleasure.
And that does it for this edition of News in Depth. From all of us here at Arirang, thank you for watching, and I have a great weekend.